Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with David Earl, who was my inspiration to set up Tony at 12. Today, we are going to take a look at the options suggested by the States of Guernsey for the rehabilitation of Alderney Airport and the future of aviation in the Channel Islands. Good to see you. Thank you very much for sparing me some time.
Good morning, Tony. Glad to be back.
Let's look at the current airfield, the runway dimensions there, if we could.
The runway here in Aldeny is illegal. The runway width or the paved runway is only 18 meters wide, and the CA require a minimum width of 23 meters. Now, if we go back in history, the runway used to be 23 meters wide, but it had a grass strip of 2.5 meters each side. And then one day the CA came along and said, sorry, it's got to be a paved runway of 23 meters. And that's where we are today.
It's currently operating under a derogation from the CAA. By definition, derogations can't last forever.
That's true. I mean, the explanation I just gave you about it originally being 23 meters, at that point, I think when the CA pointed out they wanted the runway 23 meters wide, they said, we'll give you a little bit of time to make that happen. And as you'll probably recall, in January 2019, the States of Guernsey, by 34 votes to 5, voted to spend roughly £11 million in the rehabilitation of Alderney Airport, which included the widening to 23 meters and some other things too.
Okay, that's fine. Now, they've now come back with option A, option B, option C, and you're going to tell us about C plus in a minute. But can we just basically go through the three options? Option A is basically to keep as we are. Is that right?
No, option A is what they proposed to do in January 2019, which is to widen the runway and do some other work to bring the airport up to spec. As you know, there are 3 runways here. There's a paved runway 0826, but there are 2 other grass runways. But so basically, option A is to make the present runway 0826 legal.
Okay, right. Then we have option B, which they say is to enable code C operation.
No, option B is basically option A with the provision to extend the runway at some later date.
Okay.
To all intents and purposes, I've ignored that because I think unless the runway is lengthened at this time, it's probably never going to be lengthened. So it's a moot point as to whether you take it into consideration.
And then we come on to option C, which is the one that they're plugging heavily at the moment. That's going to be a runway length of 1,050 meters plus 23 meters wide. Now, I believe that fails your test.
Well, if you bother to read CAP 168, which is the CAA's Bible of airport licensing, and what you have to understand is the CAA actually licensed Alderney Airport. And basically, CAP 168 says that if you want to operate an aircraft larger than the present Dornier or Twin Otter or Trilander or whatever, those 19-seat aircraft or less, you need to widen the runway to 30 meters.
So it doesn't give you much confidence if the States of Guernsey make a presentation of options A, B, and C, and it turns out that option C is not correct.
I don't know how they managed to come to this. My understanding is that Orkneys approached Airbus and asked, or should I say ATR, and asked them what is the minimum runway that the ATR 72 could operate on, and it seems that they said 1,050 by 23 meters, or they said that an ATR could operate on a runway that was 1,050 by 23 meters, except that the CAA say that an ATR 72-600 series is a category 3C aircraft, which requires a minimum width of 30 meters. So I'm not sure where all that came from.
But ultimately, it's the CAA that makes the decision, isn't it, in terms of things like this? You can't just go put your hand up and say, well, the manufacturer said it was going to be okay at 23.
I'm sure ATR sort of saw the sale of one or two more ATR 600s somewhere in the future, especially if the Orkneys were going to sell, excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat, sell the, not the Dornier, the Embraer 195.
Yeah.
So basically, if they wanted to establish what is their ultimate plan of a single type airline, which I have no problem with. I mean, you've only got to look at Ryanair and even Blue Islands closer to home to know that that is the way to run an airline, or certainly the most cost-effective way of running an airline. But as to whether the operator, the manufacturer of the aircraft can specify the runway width when Cat 168 quite clearly says it has to be 30 meters wide. Now, you know, the CAA license it, but that also has to be ratified by the Court of Guernsey. So whether or not somewhere along the line, they can actually apply for yet another derogation, which would be crazy. You know, you spend money clearing one derogation and making the runway legal, only to have to go cap in hand and ask for another derogation in order to be able to operate a larger aircraft.
There was a smaller ATR around, wasn't it? Was it the ATR 42?
Yes, the ATR. Yes, there was. There's an Orkney used to have one, and Blue Islands used to have one.
Yeah.
There are only two ATR 42s left on the British register, and as far as I know, they're all operating up in Scotland. So right. We no longer have any ATR 42s in the local fleets.
And there's no plan for ATR to come up with a short takeoff version.
There certainly is. There are designs for a STOL version of the ATR, but none of them have been built so far. So I suspect in the present economic environment, that's probably not terribly high on their list of priorities, especially when they are concentrating all their efforts onto what I think we may talk about later, which is zero emission aviation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, okay. Yes, we will come on to that a little bit later on. Now, looking at the total cost, assuming that they went for option C plus, i.e. at 30 meters, they said in that circular that they issued that the cost of refurbishing it in 2019 was 12.2 million.
It was around that figure, yes. I thought it was 11 point something,
yeah.
But I won't argue.
Well, this is what they actually put in their summary of the options. Now, if you then factor in inflation and everything else, shortage of materials, that 12.2 million is not going to cover the cost, is it? Even if they just stayed on their option A.
I would be very surprised if they could still produce it for that amount. I'm not an expert, but I would imagine you're probably looking at closer to 15 million, possibly even more.
50.
No, 15.
15 million for
the original.
Based on that original option
A.
Yeah.
Which is basically just legalize what we have now. Would increase from sort of round about 12 million to, well, I'm guessing sort of 30% increase, something like that. It's around 15 million.
Okay, so that gives you a bit of a yardstick, doesn't it, in terms of what's going to happen if they get ahead with option C plus, because if they're talking to if 15 million is the right sort of number, the likely cost of having to do the full works, runway, apron, terminal building, etc., is probably going to be a lot closer to the 50 million pounds that's been bandied around. Would you agree with that?
I wouldn't disagree with it.
So, you know, you then go on to say, well, how do you justify that cost if we're in a situation where the States of Guernsey are having to impose additional taxes to pay for, you know, their deficit of 80 million a year, their operating deficit? Where does it all come from?
I think one of the things you have to bear in mind that the cost of doing the renovation is capex, or capital expenditure, and that is a very different sum to operational expenditure.
Yeah, so in other words, they've budgeted for it and the funds are probably available in terms of this great big lump of cash that they've got for major projects. Is that right?
I am assuming that is correct.
Yeah, okay. Now, I suppose the principal advantage of the full-length runway is medivac.
What do you mean by full-length runway?
Well, working on the basis that it's the runway that's sufficiently long enough to accommodate the plane that currently operates out of Jersey and Guernsey.
Well, before we go on to that, I think it's important that we differentiate between runway width and runway length.
Yeah.
The runway width is a legal requirement. The runway length depends on the type of aircraft one wants to operate on it. And that really is down to Orkneys as the operator.
Right, okay.
So basically, if you look at the ATR website, it will tell you that the ATR 72-600 series ideally requires a runway that is 1,400 meters long, and what Guernsey ports are proposing is a runway 1,050 meters long. But then we'll go back to what I think was your question, which is about medivacs. And yes, if you can exceed 1,000 meter length in terms of the runway, you can operate 24/7 medivac services using a smaller aircraft.
And that's a dedicated aircraft for such purposes, isn't it?
That is.
Yeah.
I mean, the one we're talking about, an aircraft that is currently used for both Jersey and Guernsey, and that's a King Air 200C series aircraft that will operate 24/7 with a runway length of 1,000 meters.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a plus.
Yes,
an expensive plus.
Except nobody's actually asked how much this is going to cost. And I did a bit of research over the weekend, and 9 years ago, when the contract was signed with Capital Air Ambulance, which has recently been taken over by Gamma Aviation, Jersey were paying £1 million a year, and Guernsey were paying £500,000 a year for that privilege. Now, the Jersey had an aircraft based in Jersey. Guernsey, the aircraft has to come originally from Exeter, though there was some talk of moving the base to Bournemouth. Now, the question is, who's going to pay that? Back in I think 2013, the States of Guernsey basically said that Aldeny didn't have sufficient runway length, and it didn't really need one because it didn't have the sort of acute cases that they have in Jersey and Guernsey. And I'm not quite sure where the logic of that comes from, because I think we have pretty much the same kind of cases that need. And I think one of the things they talk about in medivacs is the golden hour, and that's the time it takes to get someone into hospital.
And that's crucial, isn't it?
It's pretty important.
Very much so. Already owned by the States of Guernsey. Are they having a bit too much influence on this, do you think?
I can't possibly comment on that. I'm not quite sure of the logic of all of this. As you know, I wrote an article which was published in the Guernsey Press. Yeah. And the reason for publishing that article, or writing that article in the first instance, was I was tired of the States of Guernsey quite simply saying, all we need to do is extend the runway at Alderney Airport by a few meters and we can land ATR 72s, which patently is untrue.
No, quite. And currently, there's a public service obligation that Orkneys have entered into, which has got 3.5 years to run. Now, obviously, we're not going to see these works sorted out in 3.5 years, I wouldn't think, would you?
I think we're probably looking at, if they, I understand that this item is due to be debated by the States of Deliberation in September. And assuming they were to vote in favour of it, I would think that we are looking at, 2025 before we can start to see the fruits of that. At the same time, the PSO expires and an awful lot of other things might happen. The cost of aviation fuel is rocketing, as you know. We are also looking, or most airlines now are looking at other forms of fuel, such as hydrogen. So I think there is a lot more that needs to be taken into consideration before you actually make a decision as to whether you lengthen the runway by a couple of 100 meters so you can land an ATR 72-600 series. Looking
at the flight magazine that Aldeny provide, I see that the fleet basically at the moment consists of one jet, 3 ATR 72s and 2 Dorniers. Correct. Obviously, they're probably going to get rid of the jet sooner or later. So they're going to need more ATRs, aren't they? Well, undoubtedly, they certainly couldn't run the route network that they currently run with 3 ATR 72s. And out of interest, I think they were probably looking at getting rid of the Embraer 195 sooner rather than later, because if I understand it correctly, it's coming up for Check C, which is a major overhaul, which will cost an awful lot of money. Big bucks. Yes. Yeah. Coming on to the question of having ATRs operating out of Alderney, you won't be able to put 72 people on board, will you? No, they're talking about only being able to fill the aircraft half full. So you're looking at around 40 passengers, slightly more on Guernsey to Alderney routes and slightly less on Alderney to Southampton routes. Do you think on those figures they'd break even on each flight? I personally would doubt it. I mean, most airlines are looking at 60-70% occupation in order to break even, possibly a lot higher now with the cost of fuel. So operating an aircraft at 50% occupancy doesn't make economic sense to me, but you know, it's not, I'm not running Orkneys. But looking at it from a financial point of view, it's going to either mean the fares will have to go up again, or the subsidy will have to be increased. It just doesn't seem to make financial sense to me. And, you know, sort of taking in the prospects of going for an ATR, how many flights a day are we likely to get? I'm not an expert on this. But a couple of my colleagues went to the drop-in and they were told that the plan at the moment is one rotation Guernsey, Aldeny, Guernsey early in the morning, and another rotation late afternoon, early evening. There was no mention of any service to Southampton. Yeah, so that looks as if the writing may be on the wall as far as that's concerned. It may just be that they hadn't formalized any plans, but you know, the question was asked, what flights are you proposing? And there was simply just 2 rotations a day, and that was Guernsey, Aldeny. Coming back to this question of the option C+, if you do that, you're going to have to spend an awful lot of money, aren't you, in terms of updating the airport. You've got to have separate arrivals, departures, security fence all the way around, possibly having to be lit at night and everything else. Do you think people are really taking that part on board? Well, thank you. Thank you for answering the question, Tony. Yes, the second you operate aircraft with more than 19 seats, not 19 passengers, 19 seats, you get into a whole new raft of legislation, primarily governing security.
As you quite rightly said, you'd need to rebuild the terminal because there's no way you could modify it because you've got to have separation of passengers. You'd need a secure facility for screening whole baggage. We'd have to have a similar level of screening of carry-on baggage and passengers that they have or had up until recently in Guernsey. They've just upgraded the system in Guernsey, but I don't think we would need to have the 3D system that they have in Guernsey, but you would still need to move into the same kind of area. You need, the next thing is the fire and rescue facility goes from level 3 to level 5. And I've heard suggestions that that would double the cost. The cost of security personnel would go up dramatically. I'm not going to mention figures, but
no.
We are talking about sort of a substantial increase. And as you quite rightly said, though this has been disputed, Steve Roberts says that we won't need a fence all the way around the airport, but I'm not sure where he's getting his information from, because you certainly need a fence all the way around Guernsey Airport.
What about the gradient from the runway to the apron?
That's
yeah.
The gradient is too steep, so they basically have to, the plan actually is to build a new taxiway that has a shallower gradient. And the other problem, and no one's really talked about it as far as I know, is when you watch the video at the drop-in, I think they must have scaled the ATR aircraft down because it looked about the size of a Dornier. If you can imagine an ATR aircraft on the ramp at Alderney Airport, there wouldn't be an awful lot of room for much else.
No, that's right. That's right. So really, apart from the fact that general aviation people will still be able to use the airport, we end up with a lot of costs, not only in terms of construction, but in terms of running. And we'd also find ourselves in a situation where it's almost a ghost airport with only 2 flights a day.
Well, yes, that's one of the problems, and we could find ourselves in a situation where the airport has reduced operating hours. It may close in the middle of the day. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pure speculation, and I think that what you've highlighted there is just quite simply the lack of information. You know, we hear about refurbishing the fire station. Well, you know, that's not a reality. You're going to have to improve the fire station. There's an awful lot of things that need to be done, and it's all very well saying, look at the economic benefits, but I haven't seen a business plan.
And of course, the fire alarm appliances themselves would have to be upgraded, presumably.
I can't comment on that.
but you know,
you go from level 3 to level 5.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking of the size of the appliances that you see in Guernsey compared with the ones
to give you an idea, Guernsey is level 6, and that's only level 6 because they have the Embraer. If they were operating just ATRs, they'd be level 5. Okay. So you could say, you could take some similarity with what's at Guernsey.
Right, now let's get off the subject of Alderney Airport, because it's a can that's been kicked down the runway for too many years, in my view. And I just wonder, quite honestly, whether it will stall as the States of Guernsey suddenly realise the sort of commitment financially and the sort of attitude of Guernsey taxpayers in terms of putting all this money into Alderney.
Well, that's very true. But before we move on to that, I mean, I'd like to make it clear that, you know, if tomorrow I was asked to vote for option A, B, or C, I would choose option C, because anything that improves the safety of Alderney Airport has got to be a good thing. I'd also like to make it clear that I'm not against operating an ATR 72-600 series aircraft into Alderney if it can be demonstrated that there are benefits and the economic benefits don't outweigh the disadvantages. So, you know, let's make it clear, I'm not against anything. I just want to see the facts.
Yeah. I would agree with you in terms of that. I mean, we've been investigating, looking at these things this morning, hopefully from an objective point of view. Let's get on to alternative forms of aviation. I believe battery planes are no longer flavour of the month.
Well, the problem is that battery technology, as it is today, quite simply can't provide the amount of power needed. I think when Mark Harrison was originally talking about battery-powered Islanders, he said that it had a battery life of about 20 minutes. And that would make sense because pretty well all the other, shall we say, test flights by similar aircraft or even smaller aircraft, you know, have a life of 20-30 minutes. And you know, what's happened is, you know, the load payload is the passenger and a big pile of batteries in the back, and there's no room for passengers. So, and 20 minutes, you could say, well, 20 minutes is enough to get to Guernsey or Jersey, so that works. But actually, in addition to that, you've got to allow for a diversion, which could be another 20 minutes, and then you've got to add 45 minutes onto that reserve. So basically, you're looking at a whole different ball game. So which explains why Cranfield, I was going to say Project Fresson, but I spent a bit of time this morning looking up Project Fresson, and I don't know if Cranfield have sort of rebranded this as Cranfield Aviation, but I could find no reference of it, no up-to-date reference of it. So yeah, it's a very difficult situation to know where we are and where we're going in terms of that, but that explains why the shift has gone from battery-powered aircraft to hydrogen-powered aircraft.
Yeah. And of course, as far as that's concerned, hydrogen, well, works very similar, doesn't it, to existing aviation fuels, other than the fact that you convert the hydrogen into electricity to power the propellers. Yeah.
It really depends on what size aircraft you're looking at. There are two different forms of propulsion. One is hydrogen fuel cells, which is where you chemically have a reaction between hydrogen and oxygen, and the oxygen comes from the air, and they create electricity. It's almost identical to an existing battery, which has a number of cells. So ergo, it's called a hydrogen fuel cell. Each cell only produces 1 to 2 volts. So they have banks of these cells, which means, you know, you multiply it. So if you have 100 of these cells, you have probably 150 volts. So that's how it works. The reason I offer a word of caution is the bigger planes that are being proposed from sort of 2035 onwards, they probably will use liquid hydrogen, and that will be a fuel that powers what for purpose of this conversation is conventional turbines and conventional propeller-driven aircraft.
But the great thing about it is all it chucks out is water out the exhaust.
Yes, but unfortunately, the supplies of green hydrogen are very limited at the moment, and it's going to take quite a long time to build up, to actually equip airports with hydrogen fuel farms instead of Jet A1 or avgas fuel farms. That's really where the big problem comes from. You know, most hydrogen today comes from cracking methane, I think it is, which is a hydrocarbon, and you still get CO2 emissions from that. So to describe hydrogen at the moment as a green fuel is, yes, it produces water when it's used to power the aircraft, but it still produces CO2.
Yeah.
And you have to produce
as part
the
of the
gas
process.
itself.
Yeah. You're fairly hopeful, though, that someone will come up with a suitable solution.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, at the moment, quite an interesting example is in the Orkneys, they have produced an awful lot of environmentally friendly energy from gas, solar, tidal.
Yeah.
They actually produce too much because there's a cable that links the Orkneys to Lerwick, and it can't carry all the energy that's produced in the Orkneys. So they came up with this idea of actually using the spare power to crack seawater into hydrogen and oxygen, well, primarily hydrogen, which is then put into a big tanker, which is taken by road, by ferry to Lerwick, and it's used to power the port area and their electricity. But it's only very small scale at the moment. You're going to have to increase that quite dramatically. You know, we're looking at millions. And I read an article earlier where Airbus has done, just signed a letter of intent with a major gas producer to actually develop a network of hydrogen. But, you know, we're going to be looking at sort of maybe, I mean, they're talking about operating the first larger planes 2025, and you're probably going to be looking at them before you've actually got the infrastructure in place to provide the fuel for those planes.
Yeah. Finally, because Mr. Zoom's telling us that we're into countdown, integrated transport policy. You wanted just to have a quick word about that.
Yes, I mean, one of the last things I did when I was on the States and before I got tired of beating my head against a brick wall was to propose something that I thought was just common sense, which was an integrated transport policy. At the time, we had the Air Transport Action Group and the Sea Transport Action Group, but they never talked to each other. You know, there was no one ever sat down and asked the question, what do we need? Not what do we want, what do we need in the way of transport? Now I'm talking about air transport, sea transport, mail, carriage of dogs, whatever you like. You know, transport covers a multitude of sins. And until you actually sit down and decide what you need, maybe what you want as well, but what you need is the important thing, you're not going to actually achieve anything. And I suggested that we actually sort of put together a presentation, which after doing the requisite research and then jumping on a plane or one of the two ferries that we now have, and went over to Guernsey and presented that presentation to the States of Guernsey. And at the end of the day, they might have gone, yeah, well, not sure about everything, but actually, it's really impressive to see Aldeny actually thinking for themselves for once.
That seems to have got lost.
Well, it had a lot of support, particularly from the hospitality industry.
Yeah.
I won't mention names, but they know who I'm talking about. Yeah. And I think it's absolutely essential that we actually take an active interest in our own transport future, and not as one senior member of the States, or former senior member of the States of Aldeny, said to me the other day, it's not our problem, it's Guernsey's.
That's a good way to end it, I think. Thank you, David, so much for sparing me some time. I've really enjoyed talking to you as ever. And no doubt you'll be on a little bit later in the year to talk about other things.
Oh, maybe.
Thank you.